The expulsion of the Hyksos is generally dated on the basis of Egyptian records and the archaeological evidence of destroyed cities in Canaan to around 1570 BCE.
The Hyksos were a group of people who gradually migrated from the land of Canaan and went into the land of Egypt. And so they took over Egypt and they ruled for some time. And then they were eventually expelled in the 16th century BCE. And so their migration to Egypt and their expulsion from Egypt is important because it's what people have tried to link the biblical Exodus with to try to prove that this was an actual historical event. But the problem with this association is that the dates and the names don't align, as we'll see as we continue reading in the book right here, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman, to see if we can get some understanding.
As we mentioned in the last chapter in discussing the dating of the age of the patriarchs, 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 tells us that the start of the construction of the temple in the 4th year of Solomon's reign took place 480 years after the Exodus. According to a correlation of the regnal dates of Israelite kings with outside Egyptian and Assyrian sources, this would roughly place the Exodus in 1440 BCE.
The regnal date, this refers to the dates when a monarch or a king ruled. And so the scholars, they used references outside of the biblical texts, such as the Egyptian and the Assyrian sources, to find out when King Solomon would have ruled. And so according to these scholars, the 4th year of Solomon's reign, it would have been around 960 BCE. And so 400 years prior to this, it would have been the Exodus, which they placed around 1440 BCE.
That is, more than 100 years after the date of the Egyptian expulsion of the Hyksos, around 1570 BCE.
And this is the problem that the scholars run into when they try to link the Hyksos expulsion out of Egypt with the biblical Exodus. The dates simply just don't match.
But there is an even more serious complication. The Bible speaks explicitly about the forced labor projects of the children of Israel and mentions, in particular, the construction of the city of Ramses, Exodus chapter 1, verse 11.
In Exodus 1 verse 11 in the NIV, it says, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh." And so this name Ramesses is what scholars find issue with, and here is why.
In the 15th century BCE, such a name is inconceivable.
These scholars say that they can't imagine a city named Ramesses in the 15th century. But why not?
The first pharaoh named Ramses came to the throne only in 1320 BCE, more than a century after the traditional biblical date. As a result, many scholars have tended to dismiss the literal value of the biblical dating, suggesting that the figure 480 was little more than a symbolic length of time, representing the lifespans of 12 generations, each lasting the traditional 40 years.
Because the biblical dates don't line up with other verifiable historical dates, many scholars, they look at these dates as being symbolic and not literal, which is what a lot of people, it's their best interest to do, since you have to tread very lightly when you try to interpret the material in the Bible, much of it as being literal.
This highly schematized chronology puts the building of the temple about halfway between the end of the first exile in Egypt and the end of the second exile in Babylon. However, most scholars saw the specific biblical reference to the name Ramses as a detail that preserved an authentic historical memory. In other words, they argue that the Exodus must have occurred in the 13th century BCE.
Which doesn't align with the literal biblical description of happening 480 years before the construction of the temple during the Solomon's reign. And so King Solomon is said to have reigned from 970 to 930 BCE, according to many sources. And so now we have scholars pointing to the 13th century to find the historical Exodus described in the Bible.
And there were other specific details of the biblical Exodus story that pointed to the same era. First, Egyptian sources report that the city of Pi Ramses, the house of Ramses, was built in the Delta in the days of the great Egyptian king Ramses II, who ruled 1279 to 1213 BCE, and that Semites were apparently employed in its construction.
A city named Pi Ramesses was verifiably built in the 13th century, and Semites were employed to build it, right? And notice that it says that they were employed and not forced to build it, right? Which is different from the biblical narrative.
Second, and perhaps most important, the earliest mention of Israel in an extra-biblical text was found in Egypt in the stele describing the campaign of Pharaoh Meneptah, the son of Ramses II, in Canaan at the very end of the 13th century BCE.
The Merneptah stele is the oldest source outside of the Bible, which proves that there was an actual real Israelite people right? And so this is dated to the end of the 13th century.
The inscription tells of a destructive Egyptian campaign into Canaan, in the course of which a people named Israel were decimated to the extent that the Pharaoh boasted that Israel's seed is not. The boast was clearly an empty one, but it did indicate that some group known as Israel was already in Canaan by that time.
Where was this group? They were already in Canaan at this time in the 13th century. Keep this in mind.
In fact, dozens of settlements that were linked with the early Israelites appeared in the hill country of Canaan around that time.
A whole bunch of Israelites were settled in the land of Canaan at that time, which later became known as the land of Israel. And I wonder why that was the case, right? We'll find that out later on in other videos. But the scholars were looking at this evidence and they came to this conclusion.
So if a historical exodus took place, scholars have argued, it must have occurred in the late 13th century BCE.
If this exodus took place at all and was an actual historical account opposed to a myth, then it must have happened during the 13th century, okay?
The Merneptah stele contains the first appearance of the name Israel in any surviving ancient texts. This again raises the basic questions. Who were the Semites in Egypt?
This is referring to the Hyksos who came into Egypt. He's asking, who exactly were these Semites then?
Can they be regarded as Israelite in any meaningful sense?
Can we say that they were really Israelites like some people would hope to be the case?
No mention of the name Israel has been found in any of the inscriptions or documents connected with the Hyksos period, nor is it mentioned in later Egyptian inscriptions, or in an extensive 14th century BCE cuneiform archive found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, whose nearly 400 letters describe in detail the social, political, and demographic conditions in Canaan at that time.
No mention of the Israelites at all during the Hyksos period, which was in the 17th and the 16th century, and there was no mention of them in the 14th century either. And so you don't get Israelites mentioned until the 13th century, and there's a very important reason for this.
As we will argue in a later chapter, the Israelites emerged only gradually as a distinct group in Canaan, beginning at the end of the 13th century BCE.
The Israelites emerged as a distinct group in Canaan. Where again? In Canaan. I want you to think about this and think about what this is saying. And like I said, in a later video, we'll reveal why this is important to know. And the answer may shock many of you.
There is no recognizable archaeological evidence of Israelite presence in Egypt immediately before that time.
And so the Bible taken literally, this will have people looking for the Exodus out of Egypt to take place during the 15th century. But the archaeological evidence just doesn't support that type of claim. And so afterwards, we see the scholars, they're looking into the 13th century they have some crumbs of clues that they found, and maybe these clues will allow scholars to make a case for the Exodus at this time, or maybe not, right? And this is what we'll find out on the next video, which is on this topic of the Exodus as well. And this will help us climb just one more rung on the ladder to get out of the pit and get into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so this here is the end of part 5 commentary on the book here, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.